and welcome to the fifth video of our History of English seminar. In this video, we are going to discuss Old English for the last time before we move to Middle English. There are two major topics that we are going to cover today, and the first one is negation in Old English, and the second one is the semantic changes throughout the history of English, and how we can actually trace these changes using the OED, the Oxford English Dictionary. Right, so let's have a look at the first topic, which is negation in Old English and in English in general. So those of you who are already familiar with the text of Colloquies that we've been working with, you might have noticed that there are these negative sentences, right? So in the ploughman, you have a sentence such as "For them they ich neum freo," because I am not free. And in the hunter, you have instances such as "Ne kannst du gut nebum hundion," aren't you able to hunt without your nets? Nese for them it is Sunday, no, because it is Sunday, right? And you see here two versions of a negated verb. One is as in the hunter, in the first sentence of the hunter, where the negator, ne, the negative particle, is separate from the verb. And the other ones, neom and nese, are univerbations, sort of developments where the negative particle actually joins together with the verb it negates, and a separate form, a separate negative form of a verb is created. So you have then, for example, in the case of neom, so ich neom freo, I'm not free, but ich eom freo would be I am free. Okay. Right. So this is how Old English looks like. And if we study actually the development of negation in not only in Old English, but also Middle English, early modern English, and if we compare that to how negation is done in English today, we might notice something that the Danish linguist Otto Jespersen actually noticed in the beginning of the 20th century. And Otto Jespersen actually noticed that the negative particle in Old English, the ne, over time sort of gets weakened and is not perceived by the speakers of Old English as being negative enough, so that a second negative particle has to be used, right? And the more the second negative particle is used, the less the original one is actually needed, so that at the end of this process, you only get the second one, which is at that point the only one, the only negator being used. We're going to see that in a minute. Right, so you have this spiral-like development, cyclical development, where you go from one negator to two negators and then to one negator again. But the one negator at the end of the process is a different one from the one we've started with. So that's why it's sometimes not really called cycle, but spiral, right? Because you don't get to the original starting. Okay. So if we look at how this looks like in English, we see the first stage in Old English. We're already familiar with that. Ich ne sedge, I don't say, right? So the negator is before the verb, a preverbal negator in Old English. Later on, you get something like I ne sehe nauich. This already begins in Old English, but is the peak of this development in Middle English. You get the second negator, nauich, which is still not obligatory, but can be used sometimes to emphasize the original negation. Right. In the third step, the second negator actually becomes obligatory. So you have to use two negators together in order to produce a negative sentence. I do not say. Later on, which in English happened in early modern English period, the first negator, the original one, is actually so weak that is not perceived as necessary anymore. And you sometimes use the n in front of the verb, and sometimes you don't do that. Right. And then you arrive at the fifth stage, which is actually sort of the first one in a different form, where you only have one negator. I do not say, but this negator, in contrast to the one in the first stage, is not used pre-verbally, but after the verb, post-verbally, right? So you have this development from one pre-verbal negator to two negators, one in front of the verb and one after the verb, and then in the end, only one negator again, but after the verb. Right? Those of you who are familiar with French are actually familiar with this third stage in standard French at this moment. So in standard French, you have je ne parle pas français, pardon my French, I don't really speak French. It's a wonderful example of this Jespersen cycle. In French, you actually have to use two negators at the same time to produce a negated sentence. And only in colloquial French, you get the same stage that you have in English nowadays, right? Where you only have one post-verbal negator. And you could actually, if you compare different languages, you will see that they are located at different stages of the process. Right? So, for example, if I'm not mistaken, most of the Slavic languages still use the pre-verbal negators, so they would be in the first or second stage, whereas Germanic languages mostly use only one post-verbal negator, such as not or nicht, and so forth, with the exception of Afrikaans, the daughter language of Dutch being spoken in South Africa, where you use two compulsory negators, one before the verb and one after the verb. But if we go back to the colloquies and we look at Jespersen's cycle, we will see that we are actually here in Old English, and as expected, we see the pre-verbal negators being used. Right? Ne fischers, ne ganz, neon, nesse, and so forth. But already in this stage, we see the beginning of the second phase where an emphatic negator starts being used. And this then culminates in the Middle English period. Right? And present-day English is, as I've already said, in the last stage, fifth stage, again in the situation where you only have one post-verbal negator. Okay, so we've now seen something about a formal change in syntax in Old English that has to do with the negation. But now what we have not done so far is talk about changes in the meaning of different words. So this is what is going to occupy us during the last session on Old English. And if we talk about semantic change and how the meaning of a word or expression can change, we're going to work with the following basic semantic change types, right? So one option one possibility what can happen with a word is that the older meaning of the word is more broad than the newer meaning, which is narrower, right? Or the opposite can happen. And the narrower meaning gets generalized so that the newer meaning is more broad than the old one. Another thing that can happen is a metaphorical or a metonymic extension, right? So you go, for example, from a concrete meaning to a more abstract meaning. Then there are two related changes. One of them is amelioration, where the older meaning was a negative one or a neutral one, and the newer meaning becomes more positive, right? So if the older one was negative and the newer one is neutral, this is also amelioration. And by the same token, if the older one was neutral and the newer one is positive, then this is also amelioration. And of course, the opposite, we call that featurization, where the older meaning is positive or neutral, and this positive or neutral meaning gets neutral or negative in the process. Right. This is all very abstract, perhaps, but we're going to see how this works in a second. And you might ask, okay, so but how can we actually know what words meant? For example, in Old English period, we can actually know that by using the Oxford English Dictionary, which is a wonderful dictionary that is accessible online and that has extensive information on the meanings of different words at different stages of their development. And to show you how this actually works, we're going to have a look at the word adder, right? So the word adder in English nowadays refers to the snake, in Latin called vipera berus, or in English also known as the common European viper, right? And you might know the cognates of this word in other Germanic languages, and not only Germanic, but you would have, for example, in Dutch, adder, in German, natter, Icelandic, you would have something nadra, but there is also the Latin cognate natrix, meaning water snake, and the Welsh one, which I can't pronounce at this moment, also meaning snake. And there is actually, before we start talking about the meaning, there is one important thing that we have to know about the form of this word in English. Because in Old English, and you might recall this from our very first introductory video where I talked about this biblical passage from the Paradise, the fall of man, where the word nedre is used, which means adder, right? And you might have noticed that in Old English there is an N in at the beginning of the word, just as there is an N in German, natter, nadra in Icelandic, and so on. So it seems that English and Dutch and also Low German actually are an exception to this. You don't have an N in the beginning. And the question is, how can this happen? And this is, in fact, fairly simple. We call it rebracketing, right? So this happens in English, in Middle English, where you have the combination of nadere, the word for adder, and the indefinite article right? Nadere, and it gets rebracketed, reanalyzed, not as nadere, but an adere, right? So the N sort of shifts from the one word to the other. And if you might think, okay, well, that's actually quite extraordinary. It's not really the case because the same thing actually happened to the word newt, apron, and nickname. Right? So, for example, apron was originally also napron, and the N shifted to the noun from the noun to the article. The other way around, this process happened for the word newt and nickname, which originally didn't have the N in the beginning. Right. But now let's have a look at the semantic changes of this word. And as I said, we are going to use the Oxford English Dictionary. You can find this at OED.com. But in order to access this dictionary in full, right, you actually have to be in the university network. For those of you who already know how this works, this is a piece of cake. But for those of you who don't, it's really important that you do that now. It's also going to be important for you in the remainder of this semester, and who knows how the university is going to be functioning in the winter term. So this is definitely a good thing to have. So you have to download a VPN client, which will allow you to log in the university network. You can find all the information about how to use the VPN client, how to install it, and how to do all the other things with it at the website of the CEDAT. Right, so do that, and you'll be able to access the OED in full. Right, but if you enter the word adder in the OED, what you'll get will look something like this, right? So here at the very top, you have a lexeme. So it says, right, an adder, and it is a noun, that is the N after the word. What you have then is here a section on the etymology of the word, where it comes from, whether it's a borrowed word or whether it got inherited from earlier stages. And then you also have information on the cognates of this word in different languages. Oh, I'm sorry, you can't really see that right now because of my camera picture, but underneath this etymology section, the different senses of the word listed. And they are also numbered and differentiated. And underneath each different sense of the word, you also get usage examples from the respective period. So, for example, here, if we look at the first sense of the word adder in the dictionary, we'll see that, right, it's marked with 1. And then it says, right, in generic sense, snake, serpent, especially with reference to the serpent, as a manifestation of the devil in the biblical account of the fall in the Garden of Eden, hence, by extension, the devil. And also the information that is now obsolete. This is also marked by the small cross that you find in front of before the small a. This means that this sense is in present-day English lost. Right. And then underneath, you see the different examples from different periods which illustrate this use of the word. Right. On the left-hand side, you will see when. Right. So EOE means early Old English, Old English, or circa 1200, about 1200 and so forth. And then also where the word was used, in what text it was used, and sometimes you even have a link so that you can click actually on the text to see the remainder of the example. Right. So again, then you see another sense of the word, right? Wing, serpent, dragon, again with the remark, it is nowadays obsolete. And then for the second sense, you see, right, numbered, sorry, before we come to that, so you also have this timeline, right? So the examples, the usage examples of the different senses are actually listed chronologically. So the very last entry tells you approximately when was the last time this word was used in this particular sense. So in the case of adder for a winged serpent or dragon, we see that it was sometimes before the year 1500, right? Okay. And then, right, as I said, second sense begins, and then again, all the different usage examples and so forth. So what have we actually seen in the OED in terms of the development of the meaning of the word adder? So we have seen that there are more things that you could see, but what we have seen is that there is the first sense is described as, in generic sense, a snake, a serpent, right? A wide meaning. What you then have is another sense, meaning winged serpent, a dragon. This is also already contained in the first sentence, where they say that adder, in this generic sense, can also be used by extension to mean the devil, right? The serpent in paradise from the biblical account. So here you have sort of metaphoric meaning, right? So it's not only a specific snake or a serpent, but it is also a metaphor for the devil. Okay, and then you have a third sentence, the third sense, which describes the common or a northern vipera, vipera berus, right? So the thing that you see on the top right hand, in the top right hand corner, a viper. And this is a more narrower meaning if you compare it to the original one, which is already documented in early Old English times. Right, so in the beginning, it was just a snake, and nowadays it is used to mean only a viper, very specific snake. Right. You also see evidence of that if you look at the chronology of the senses. Right, so on the right, so here the bigger one is the meaning for viper, which you actually see being used all through the different periods. And the last here documented example is from the 1990s, but obviously this is still being used. But if you compare that to the first original meaning, which is more generic, meaning a snake, a serpent in general, we see that it also begins in Old English already, but the last example of this comes from the first half of the 19th century, but this seems to be a very isolated example. The last example before that is here documented in the 15th century, so this must have been very infrequent at that. Okay, so if we have a look at the development of the meaning of adder, once again, we'll see that there was this wider meaning, which referred to a snake, a serpent in general. And from this wider meaning, a sort of metaphoric meaning developed, where adder meant a dragon or devil, right? And from this wider meaning, then another thing developed, which nowadays is the normal thing, when the word adder actually only refers to the common viper, right? So what you see is the narrowing of a meaning. In the beginning, the word meant snake in general. Nowadays, it only means a very specific type of snake. Okay. That was it. And what about next time? So next time, we're going to continue with discussing these different semantic changes throughout the development of English. And in order for you to be able to participate in this discussion, please have a look at a preparatory text on the Old English Lexicon, and then have a look at the handout where you will have a list of 15 words, and your task is to do basically the same thing as I did right now for adder, and to describe the changes that happen between Old English and present-day English to the meaning of those 50 words. And apart from that, we are slowly moving out of Old English right now, because next week is going to be our last session on Old English. But if you find Old English interesting, here are just some websites that you can use to sort of stay in touch with Old English. There are different dictionaries, or for example, the Old English Wordhord is also a Facebook page, or you can order a email every week from the Dictionary of Old English, and you will always regularly get an email explaining one Old English word. And what's also nice is the Wiktionary page, where you have many details on the development of English words. Right, so there is fairly detailed information on the etymology of different words. Okay, so looking at semantic changes to different words will be the last thing that we'll do with Old English, and after that we are going to have a look at Middle English at the period of knights, chivalry, and fighting snails. That's all for today. Thank you, and see you during our online session. Bye.